Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and this is the first of a two-part series where I explore the new charts framework introduced in iOS 16, and specifically the BarChart type of chart. In this first video, I'll focus solely on the charts framework and how BarCharts are created in order to build a concrete basis and understanding that you'll be able to put to use in your own projects. In the second video, we'll do just that. I'm currently redesigning one of my own apps, my Wine Cellar, and I want to replace a UIKit chart framework with the new SwiftUI version. I'll provide you with the data, and we'll explore different ways of grouping and presenting that data in BarCharts. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. There's a starter project for this series, and I encourage you to download it and work along with me. I'm not going to go over any of the code in this video because we won't be using it here except for the two files in the intro charts folder. If you run the app in the simulator, you'll find that these two views are never presented. But we can use the SwiftUI preview to build out some examples of bar charts that will help us in the future. Of course, you need to be using Xcode version 14 or higher in order to take advantage of the charts framework. And at the time of this video, I'm using beta 3, as it's not yet been released beyond beta. Now, SwiftUI charts are made using the charts framework. And think of a chart as a two-dimensional graph where you have both an X and a Y axis. You build charts in a very friendly SwiftUI way by composition. And the basic component of a chart is a mark. And you can choose from an area mark, a line mark, a point mark, a rectangle mark, a rule mark, or a bar mark. And you can also choose to have different types within your chart. Now, each mark has a value for both the X and Y component, but don't get fixated on X and Y in the traditional graph paradigm where X is along the horizontal and Y is on the vertical axis. The values can fall into one of three different categories. Quantitative, and quantitative is numerical data such as the number of products sold or the temperature of a room or the price of a stock. So it's an int, a float, or a double. You can have nominal values, which are categorical values that represent discrete categories or groups, and they're strings or string-valued enums. And finally, we have temporal data, which is a point or interval in time, so a date. Now, when you're building a chart, the axis with the quantitative data determines whether or not the graph will be vertical or horizontal. The other axis is either nominal or temporal. So let's start with a nominal example. Now, as I said, in this tutorial, we'll primarily focus on bar charts. So let's start with the one that has a nominal x-axis and a quantitative y-axis, so a vertical bar chart. So open the nominal charts example. Now I've created a struct called wine log, and it has 4 properties. It records when I added wine to my cellar. I record quantity, country, entry date, and you'll see in the next video that I actually record it differently, but I have this struct here for demonstration purposes that we can use for our bar charts. Now I've also created a function where I can easily create dates providing a year, month, and day. Now these two objects, the wine log and function, are created outside of our struct, so we can use these both in this view and in the view for the next example. Specific to this view, however, we've created 2 instances of our wine log, and I'll call them wine 1 and wine 2. I want to be able to represent my 2 wine entries in a bar chart, and it's pretty clear that the quantitative data is my quantity value, while I have 2 choices for my nominal data. It's either the variety or the country. My temporal choice would be the entry date, but I'll leave that until the next view. Now the first thing that we need to do is to import charts. Next, I'm going to replace this VStack with a chart. And then within the chart, I'm going to add a single bar mark. And we'll use the initializer that just has an X and Y property, which are both plottable value types. So starting with .value, you'll see that you get to enter a string, which is a label, and a value, which is some plottable value. And you could use any of the three different types. So let's start by wanting to compare our quantities, which is obviously the quantitative property, to varieties that we might have. Since the quantitative value is quantity, we can determine the direction of the graph that we want it to go. So if we want it to be vertical, it must be a y component, and therefore our variety must be the x component. So we'll use wine1's property for this. You immediately see a vertical bar rise up, and the axis goes from 0 to 15, with Chardonnay being our first entry along the x-axis. The default color is the application's accent color, and in this app I've changed that to be a purple color. I'll duplicate this bar mark now and use wine2. And when I do that, you see that the graph's y-axis automatically adjusts as another bar is added. Now let me change the nominal value from variety to country. Now since the quantitative data doesn't change, the chart looks the same, but the labels along the x-axis are now showing countries instead. Now what would happen if wine2 is also from Canada? This creates a stacked bar chart, but I can't tell which one is which. So what we can do is we can add a foreground style to each bar mark to change the color. Or I can just leave the first one alone and leave it as purple, but I'll give the second one the style. And it can be any shape style, and color is a shape style. So let's just apply green. You see that the bar mark now clearly distinguishes the two different types, but we can't tell which one is Chardonnay and which one is Merlot. What we can do then is to let the charts framework decide on the style based on the variety, and we do this by using a foreground style by modifier. And we'll use a value type here as well. We can use wine1.variety for the first, and then for the second, we'll use wine2.variety. And this automatically generates a legend for us. So we'll see that the varieties are clearly marked in the legend. If I go back now and change the country of wine2 to United States, you'll see that the countries are separated again. But the legend is still there, so we know what wine is represented. Let's duplicate wine2 and call it wine3, but I'll change the variety to Chardonnay and the quantity to 15, and I'll set the entry date to be the 24th of the month. And then I'll add a new bar mark for this wine, along with a corresponding foreground style by, to assign its own color. Great, we see both countries now and what wines were added for both. Now this is pretty good, but there's a lot of duplicate code, and it's not likely that you'd be creating your bar marks like this. You would most likely be getting your data from some kind of data source, and you'd loop through it with a for each loop. But to simulate this, we'll use a for each loop, and that requires that our data be identifiable. And we'll need to add an ID property. So we'll make winelog conform to the identifiable protocol, and for the ID, we'll just use an instance of the UUID. Now after the body, I'm going to create a new constant that I'll call wines. That'll be an array of all three wines that we've created. I want to keep that first chart here as a reference, so I'm going to add a second chart just below this one. And as soon as I do that, you'll see that our other chart reduces to half the height. And I'll make sure I add padding as well. Next, I can use a for each loop And Xcode even knows what I want to do, so it'll use wine as the iterator. And then I can create a bar mark, just like one of the ones above, but make sure that this time I'll use just wine, the iterator, and its properties. You'll often see this shortened version by removing the iterator altogether and using the shorthand $0. And now, since all we have is a for each loop within our chart, I can take this identifiable variable wines and move it into the chart constructor and remove the for each altogether. That's pretty cool, huh? Here's one more thing. What if we wanted this chart to be horizontal instead? Well, all we have to do is reverse the X and Y values. For our second example, I'm going to demonstrate a chart that uses temporal values or time-based values. I've replicated the same 3 wines as the previous example, along with that wines array in this view. And I've also imported the charts framework. So let's go ahead now and create a chart as before using that wines array, but this time for the X values, we'll use temporal data, date, for the X-axis, as well as before for the quantitative data, we'll use the quantity again for the Y-axis. Now, even though our dates are only 1 day apart in sequence, we're seeing that the bars are rather narrow with a lot of space in between. And that's because by default, the unit being used is hour. So there's enough room for 24 different bars in each section between the days. So we can specify that we want the unit to be day. And this makes the difference. We'd also like to know what country was entered in each date. So using the foreground style modifier, we'll use the country's value. Now, if we reverse the X and Y properties, we'll see that the axis shifts. Let's revert back again. I don't like the fact that the data is showing at the beginning of the bar instead of being right under the bar at the center. So we can improve on that by adding a chart X-axis modifier. And this will allow us to specify how we want our axis labels to be displayed. Now, if we don't enter anything, our identifiers for our bars, the X-axis, disappear. Now, if we add an instance of the axis marks, it comes right back again. However, if we use the version for axis marks that provides us with a closure, it'll provide us with a value. Now, we're not actually going to use this value, but we could. Instead, within the closure, we'll create an instance of a axis value label, which, as with axis marks, we can choose the default with no arguments. And it'll bring back those default views again. Now we've got lots of options that we could use here, however, one of which is format. If I wanted to specify my date differently from the month and day option, that's the default. However, I like that, so I'm not going to do that, specifying a format. Instead, I'm just going to say that I want the label to be centered. So I can choose that argument and specify true. Let's change the date on the Canadian Chardonnay to be the 24th of the month. And you notice how the data moves, that we now get a stacked chart. What's problematic, however, is that the X-axis value labels are messed up again, and I'm not entirely sure why, and I'm wondering if this might be a bug. If I duplicate wine 3, for example, and change the wine to wine 4 instead, and give it the date of the 25th of the month, and add that to my array, everything looks good again. I did, however, find that I can fix this a bit by adding in a format argument to my axis value label. So let's remove wine 4 again to mess it up and add in this format using the date time, specifying month and day. Now the dates are doubled at the beginning and the end, but at least it's better than it was. It seems this only happens if I have a stacked chart. So let me change the Canadian Chardonnay back to the 22nd for now. Up until now, we've been using the quantity as the quantitative axis and either country or variety as the other, or what I refer to as the base axis. Well, it turns out that a temporal value can also be used to replicate the quantitative axis. So I'm going to create a new chart, and I'm going to use the exact same chart as the first one. Now, instead of using the Y value being the quantity, I'm going to make it country and change the foreground style to be based on variety. And now you see that because the date replaces the quantity, it becomes the axis that generates our bars. And because it's in the x-axis value, we get a horizontal bar chart. And the nominal data is on the y-axis, with the dates extending to the right along the x-axis. If I switch the axis around by reversing x and y, I'll also have to change the chart x-axis to be a chart y-axis to set the axis values. This is probably clearer in that we see that we added Canadian wines on the 22nd and US wines on the 23rd and 24th. The trouble now, though, is that we have no idea how many Chardonnay for Canada were added. What we can do is add another modifier to our bar mark, and that's an annotation. Now this has a closure that is a view. So if we just type in a text view saying the string hello just to see what happens, we see that it prints above each bar. So why don't we print the quantity using the string interpolation for our $0 representation of our wine, which is the iterator, to access that quantity's value. But we get this error saying that the annotation context has no member quantity. And again, I'm puzzled by this error because what I can do is, instead of using this $0 shortcut, I can go back to using wine in and replacing the $0 with the iterator wine. And when we do this, the quantity now gets placed above the bar. Well, I can add an argument to our annotation modifier called position, and that provides us with a number of choices where I want the position of this to be. And I want it to be an overlay, smack dab in center of our bar. And now I can stylize this text view by setting a foreground color of white, and I can set the font to bold. We can check our color scheme variants to see that our charts are looking pretty good. Well, that's the basics of bar charts, and these concepts can also be used for other types of charts too, but that's for another day. There are a lot of other modifiers that you can use to make your charts more readable, but we've only been working with 3 or 4 different bar marks. What if you had data that was much more complex? In the next video in our series, we'll explore a large data set of wine information that I've included with the project and take a look at how we can make sense of that data by grouping and filtering that data so that we can present it in a way that will be helpful to our users. The data set that is provided has objects representing 313 different wines from 135 different wineries covering 111 different varieties. And there's also a log for 669 different ins and outs over a period of 2 years. That's a lot of information, and this list just doesn't give me a feel for what's going on. Well, we can group data sets by category and then ensure that each bar is tappable to show a list of corresponding wines as I tap on each one. Or in this other view, we can use the same view to display scrollable bar charts, and we can apply annotations to display the values of the numbers, which is especially important when the axis disappears when we scroll. And then in the third example, we'll create a stack bar chart to represent the total number of wines in and out, giving the user the ability to scale the size of the bars and decide which year they'd like to view. We'll include annotations here as well, and a rule mark that will designate when we pass a critical monthly consumption level. So I hope you return to view the final video because we're going to cover a lot more customization that you may find useful in your own projects.